Hello, everyone. So we're going to have a few minutes until we get started, but just to let you know, this is the Level Up series, and we will be starting in just a few minutes. Hello, everyone. We have just about another minute here before we get started. So let's just give everyone one more minute, and then we're going to start with some welcoming announcements. All right, it is now 3 o'clock, so let's get started today. So first of all, welcome everyone. My name is Heather Stoven and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am the Extension Master Gardener Coordinator and Extension Horticulturalist in Yamhill County. Yamhill County, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya following the Willamette Valley Treaty, homelands of the Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, the Kalapuya were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, the living descendants are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Round Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Thank you for coming today to this Growing Oregon's Level Up series session. This series is produced by the Oregon State Extension Master Gardener Program and has been organized and led by a group of Master Gardener coordinators, OSU faculty, and from staff across the state. The OSU Master Gardener Program educates Oregonians about the art and science of growing and caring for plants. We are in 27 counties across the state and train thousands of Master Gardener volunteers. OSU Extension Master Gardeners are volunteer educators, neighbors, and on-the-ground researchers who serve their communities with solid training in science-based sustainable gardening and a love of lifelong gardening and learning. If you're a Master Gardener volunteer, thank you for dedicating your time and knowledge. If you're not a Master Gardener but are interested in becoming one, we'll be hosting training for new volunteers in 2022. You can learn more about the program and about other workshops in the series in our website. Today's workshop is being recorded and will be accessible to view, along with all the presentations in the series at our site. I'll put a link in the chat box to our website in a moment here. So just a few general housekeeping items. All participants are muted. So please use the Q&A box for your questions. That's at the bottom of your screen. We'll have 5 minutes for questions in the middle of Weston's presentation and 5 minutes for questions again at the end. Use the chat box for general things you want to share, but please use the Q&A box for questions that you have for the presenters. And as a moderator, I will share those with Weston when we get to his time. We have approval for 1 Oregon Landscape Contractors Board credit hour for watching this webinar. So please contact me, Heather Stoven, if you are licensed with the board and would like to receive credit. And I will put my email address in the chat box in a moment. Our presenter for today will also have a link for an evaluation form, which will be placed in the chat box. Annually, our OSU instructors are required to be evaluated by our audience, giving you all the chance to provide feedback about the presenter. Please fill out this evaluation for Weston. But it will be placed in the chat, a link for it will be placed in the chat box in the beginning as well as at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing here and I'm going to allow Weston to start sharing, and then I'm going to introduce him for our talk today, which is Dirt Gone Bad When Your Soil Amendment Has Been Contaminated. So Weston Miller.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, hi, Weston. Sorry to interrupt. All right, so I'm going to introduce you quickly, Weston, and then you can get started. So Weston Miller is a community and urban horticulturist for OSU Extension Service. He manages the OSU Master Gardener program in the Portland metro area. Weston leads a statewide effort, Solve Pest Problems, to develop a comprehensive pest management website for gardens and landscape settings. Metro and DEQ requested he write a publication on herbicide contaminated compost as a part of this body of information. So thank you very much, Weston, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. It's great to see you in online land. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. This presentation is called Dirt Gone Bad When Your Soil Amendment Has Been Contaminated. Another way to say that is what to do about herbicide contaminated compost and soil mix. Additionally, how to use compost. Let me just tell you a little bit of story about the origin of this topic. Last spring in the Portland metro area, a number of gardeners bought loads of compost from a reputable compost landscape supply company. And they took the material home, they put it out in their vegetable garden, and then planted their tomatoes and other kinds of crops. A couple weeks later, noticed that there was some damage, some curling of the leaves, and they were wondering what's going on. So just imagine like 2-3 months into the pandemic, being a new vegetable gardener and then getting a bad batch of compost that has herbicide contamination. So many of these gardeners made formal complaints to the Oregon Department of Agriculture. They went out to the field and observed what was going on. And they not only noticed that there was indeed herbicide contaminated compost, but they also saw that in a lot of situations, people were using compost incorrectly. And as a result, ODA and Metro, the regional government, approached me with OSU and asked me to write a couple publications on the topic. And that's the origin of this presentation. And then we'll provide links to those publications that we made that address these topics. And the topics that we are going to cover today include this. Here's a preview of what we're going to talk about. So herbicide contaminated compost, identifying the damage, crops affected, lookalikes, like, so how can you tell this damage from other things, remediation options and how to avoid the problem. And then in terms of how to use compost, we're going to talk about choosing the right product and the right amount of product, common mistakes, and then I'm going to go through vegetable gardens, landscape areas, new and existing lawns, and provide some sort of details about how to apply compost. And the photo in this picture, if a picture says 1,000 words, this picture here says it all in terms of what you need to know about compost. When you add compost to the soil and dig it in as deeply as possible, in essence, you're feeding the soil microbes. Those microbes will get excited. They'll break down that organic matter. When they do that, they will make a natural glue, and that causes the soil particles to stick together or form PEDs. Then that allows for more air and more water to enter the soil. So in many, many ways, adding compost improves the soil structure. When roots are better able to penetrate the soil, your plants will become established faster. And then also compost does provide some small amounts of nutrients for plants, but not all of the nutrients. And I'll go into some of that detail along the way. But for right now, just keep in your mind this picture. If you take one image home, it's this right here. Add compost to the soil, spread it out, dig it in as deep as possible before you install your plants. The regional composting system relies on many feedstocks. So a feedstock would be a source of compost. Cow manure would be a feedstock. Grape pumice, mint compost. Those are all different feedstocks. Some of them can contain contamination from persistent herbicides that live or don't break down right away through both the composting process and animal digestion. Some of the potential sources of herbicide contaminated compost include hay, grass clippings, manure, animal bedding, mushroom compost when the above materials are used. So here's where I'd highly advise not buying compost off of Craigslist, because especially a horse manure, horse bedding compost could potentially have herbicide contamination. Also, sometimes when like a compost maker buys some of these contaminated materials, they make a big pile, they distribute it out to a bunch of people. That's what happened last spring. The persistent herbicides that are problematic, that persist composting, are aminopyralid and clopyralid. And these aren't herbicides that you can get your hands on yourself. They're used by licensed pesticide applicators for hay fields and pastures, golf courses, roadways, grain crops, natural areas, and lawns. They are growth regulator herbicides, similar to 2,4-D in that they affect just dicot plants. And I'll go into that in a moment here. This herbicide damage that I'm going to show you is not just from contaminated compost, but it would be herbicide damage from any growth regulator herbicide. So with tomatoes, they are very susceptible to it. People love growing their tomatoes, of course. And what you'll see is this distorted or cupping of the leaves. And it's usually going to be the end leaves. In beans, you'll see distorted growing points like you can see here, beans and peas in the same family. With squash, the damage you might see is elongated and cupped growth. So just note, if you see all your tomatoes are showing that kind of same sign, you're like, this is potentially herbicide contamination. Then the process would be to determine what the cause of the herbicide contamination. It could be drift coming from a neighbor's property. Some herbicides like 2,4-D can volatilize and drift onto your property without you knowing it from your neighbors. But in terms of pinning it down to herbicide contaminated compost, you'd have to think back and be like, okay, did I apply a product, and how long afterwards until I started to see these kinds of symptoms? Important to point out that the herbicides that we are talking about, the growth regulator herbicides, they damage dicot plants. And thinking back to your high school biology class, monocots have one seed leaf, dicots have the two seed leaves. Basic distinction of plant groups. Monocots include corn and grasses. Dicots, especially ones that are damaged by these herbicides, the beans and peas, tomatoes, peppers, and potatoes, squash, lettuce, sunflowers, and dahlias. These are all grouped by plant family, by the way. Spinach, chard, and beets, carrots and parsley, roses, grapes, hemp and cannabis sativa, and other broadleaf plants. So those are the kinds of plants that would show damage from growth regulator herbicides. Before, as you're doing your detective work, it's really important to basically try to rule out other causes of plant damage. So plant injury from nutrient deficiencies, plant diseases, or insect pests can look similar to herbicide damage, and I'll give you a couple examples here. You should suspect herbicide damage when more than one type of plant is affected. So for example, tomatoes and beans. The damage appears only on one part of the plants, like the growing tips, and you've ruled out other causes of plant damage. One lookalike you should know about is nutrient deficiency, and this is magnesium deficiency in tomatoes. It typically occurs in the older leaves, and magnesium deficiency, green veins and a yellow inside. This might look a little similar in some ways to the herbicide damage. Another lookalike are mosaic viruses. Mosaic viruses called stunted growth and the distorted leaves and kind of a mottled pattern. They're usually going to affect just one kind of plant, such as tomatoes or grapes. And herbicide injury, again, would affect several different kinds of plants, for example, both grapes and tomatoes. And then another lookalike is insect or mite damage. In this case, Erinium mites on grape leaves. That damage is going to be kind of sporadic on one plant, not across the whole plant or a bunch of different plants. So when you see random damage, that's a little more indicative of a biotic factor like insects or mite damage, and not an abiotic thing like herbicide damage. So what are your options if you end up with a bad pile of compost? So let's say you bought a pile, you hear on the news that compost from X vendor has potential contamination. What do you do about it? These are the different options that you have, and I'm going to lay out sort of this in outline form and then go into each of these different points here. The first is performing a bioassay, and I'll give you the steps and a link to be able to do that. If you have a big pile of compost and you haven't already applied it to your veggie garden beds, let's say, then you might try to divert it and use it for lawn ornamental grasses, irises, other monocots, they're not going to be affected by the growth regulator herbicide. Remember, that affects just the dicot plants. And then if you already have applied it to your vegetable garden bed, one option that you have is to grow corn. And we'll talk shortly about whether or not you can eat that corn. And then lastly, in terms of remediating the soil, your choices are to wait, just do nothing and hope it'll break down over time. Encourage soil life to hasten the breakdown process, to use cover crops, again, to encourage biological activity in the soil to break stuff down. We'll talk about activated carbon and biochar, again, encouraging the soil microbial community. And then the last resort would be removing the soil physically, which is impractical in most scenarios. Here's a really important point. Can I eat produce from plants showing herbicide damage? And the answer is no. First, what you would want to do is find out the exact name of the herbicide involved. And the only ones I listed here are the persistent herbicides that are associated with compost, aminopyralid and clopyralid. With aminopyralid, they're not labeled for edible crops at all. So if you knew that you had that specific material, you absolutely shouldn't eat it. If you know the material is clopyralid, then I would recommend calling the National Pesticide Information Center. That's a national program that's based at OSU, and their number is right here. You can also look it up, and they would coach you through the decision-making that you'd want to do before you go eating any produce that's contaminated by a persistent herbicide. So the bottom line is find out what the exact material is and call NPIC, the National Pesticide Information Center. One of the first steps, if you have a pile of compost, or even before you buy compost, if you can get a small sample, you can perform bioassay. So this is basically a test where you set up, let's call it 10 pots with control, with like a different potting soil. You set up test plots of the same number of containers, and that would have the soil mix or the compost in question. You plant pea seeds, they're relatively fast growing. You provide them with regular care, and you evaluate them over time and take photos. And up on the top here, you can see that the damage is slight. There's very little damage compared to the bottom here. There's much more damage. So that process of doing the bioassay gives you more information from which to make a informed decision. If you're seeing damage, then that would take you down a whole different line of additional research to try to figure out what's going on. Here is a bioassay showing known concentrations of growth regulator herbicide. The control group is on the left-hand side, so no herbicide involved at all. And you can see as the concentration goes up, the success of the peas goes down pretty dramatically here in this picture. So if you have healthy looking peas, then your pile of compost is probably good to go. If you're seeing herbicide damage, then you'd want to take note, contact the company where you bought the material and take it from there. As I mentioned, if you have a big pile of compost, you know that it's contaminated. What can you do with it? You could put it out onto your lawn area, and your lawn won't show any damage at all because the grasses, the monocots will be just fine. If you're going for an eco lawn, your clovers and other things might show some damage. So a straight up turf grass lawn would be one option, what to do with that material. Another is to grow corn. Corn, again, is a monocot. It's not going to show the damage from the growth regulator herbicide. And here, if you know the exact name of the herbicide, you could contact NPIC to see if you could eat it, or you could grow it basically as an ornamental corn and call it good and make it into a bundle for Halloween. Other choices in terms of remediation. So these are organic materials that will break down slowly over time. It might take 2 to 5 years to break down. So that is certainly one option. If you've already applied contaminated compost or soil mix to your garden, you can basically just wait, and eventually the materials will break down. I would probably continually do the bioassay test to gauge the progress of the breakdown process. Once you don't see any damage, then you're probably good to follow up and plant tomatoes and peas and beans and carrots and other dicot vegetable garden crops. That might be a long and frustrating process. If it were me, I'd want to try to encourage soil microbial activity to get it to break down as fast as possible. And the way to do that is to incorporate air into it. So fluffing up the soil with a digging fork or a spade works really well. If you wanted to, you could add non-contaminated compost that would increase the soil microbial community. You could add fertilizer. A fertilizer will also help the microbes to their population to kind of expand and hasten the breakdown. And then during the dry season, if your soil dries out, the biological activity is going to go down very quickly. If you keep the soil moist through the summer, that would allow the processing of these materials and will help it to break down faster. And then again, you can use the bioassay test to kind of determine the progress of the breakdown of the persistent herbicides. Another option is to grow a cover crop, and this is Sudan grass. Sudan grass is a warm season cover crop, and you can see it grows very, very tall, and there's an awful lot of biomass here. Once this material is grown, you have a couple different choices. If you want to remove the herbicide from this area as fast as possible, I would probably harvest the biomass, take it and compost it off to the side where you're not going to be growing vegetables or other crops. And then that compost could be used for other monocots like your lawn area or irises and things like that. The main thing is getting it into the biomass and then removing the biomass from the plot. And I'd love to say that the dog and the kid are mine, but they're not. This is a stock photo. Another choice is to grow a dicot cover crop. In this case, tiller radishes, sunflowers, other dicots. Harvest that material, take it off to the side, compost it away from where you're going to be growing your vegetable garden in the future. Or the material could also be disposed of in the trash. You don't want to put it in your green bin or send it to municipal recycling, because that's just kicking the can down the road, and the persistent herbicide could harm other people down the line. Biochar is another option to increase soil biological activity or activated carbon. This would probably be fairly low on my list because activated carbon and biochar are expensive, and I think you could do just as well by adding regular compost and just fluffing up the soil. If you live east of the Cascades or other regions where the soils are naturally alkaline, biochar will raise the soil pH a little bit, so you might run into problems. So this would be more appropriate for Western Oregon than it would be for the eastern part of the state or other alkaline areas. The last option here is to remove the soil. And here's the thing about moving dirt. So number one, it's heavy. It's difficult to get back into a truck once it's dumped out. And then it's heavy to move, so the hauling fee will be high. And then most importantly, it's also really expensive to get rid of 10 yards of dirt at the dump. It's going to cost an arm and a leg, and I would highly recommend all of the other steps before considering disposing of the material in this way. You're probably wondering, how do you go about avoiding contaminated product in the first place? And here's where I highly recommend that you do your research. So what I would do if I were to buy a large pile of compost, I would go to the vendor in person, look at the different products that they have. And then once I made the decision on the product, I would take a small amount of it, ask if I can take a sample, take it home and do a bioassay test. be in communication with the vendor and say, hey, it's going to be about a month before I'm going to buy this. Are you still going to be working on the same pile? If yes, then your efforts would probably be good because you could do a quick bioassay test, see if there's any damage. If there's not, then it's likely that you're good to go. If you do see herbicide damage, then you know that that's not the pile for you and you can take your business elsewhere. So that takes pre-planning, but nonetheless, if you want to be extra safe, this would be one way to go. Another option that I would recommend is call the landscape supply company, the compost company, ask them, hey, what do you do about herbicide contaminated compost? How do you know that your product is not contaminated? If they have a good answer for you, hopefully they're on top of it and monitoring their sources and making sure that they're not bringing in contaminated material. If they don't know what you're talking about, that would be an opportunity to move to a different vendor and find someone who's going to be more responsive to your needs. As we mentioned at the outset of the presentation, we created a publication on this topic. So herbicide contaminated compost and soil mix, what you should know and what you can do about it. You can find it at the OSU Extension Service publication catalog. It's EM9307. You can just look up that keyword and find pretty quickly. All of the details that I just went through are expanded upon in the publication. And additionally, there's lots of great resources out there on herbicide contaminated compost. Here's some. So plant injury from herbicide residue, diagnosing herbicide injury in garden and landscape plants. If you see your plants look funky, if the growing tips of your tomatoes and beans are funky, do some research, do the bioassay test, try to figure out what's going on. And now's the time I can take a handful of questions from Heather.
Great, thank you, Weston. Yeah, we have a few questions here in the chat box that I would like to share with you. There's quite a few questions about how you know which pesticides are in your compost potentially, and how the lab works in terms of how do you send it? Do you send it to a lab, or what?
Yeah, that's a great question.
That sort of thing.
Sure. I would advise against sending a compost product to a lab. You have to pay for every individual test, and that could get expensive pretty fast. I think what I would do is if you notice that there is damage and you suspect that it's from compost or soil mix, contact the vendor, let them know the situation, and or file a formal complaint with the Oregon Department of Agriculture. And then like last spring, after so many people filed complaints and they did some research, ODA went and did all the testing, and then they announced formally that it was clopyralid was the contaminated compost. You're not going to be able to know that on your own. You really need to go through the vendor and potentially ODA to get that information.
Great, thank you, Weston. And then can you address if commercial compost suppliers, if they do some testing for herbicides in their compost?
Yeah, it is in the best interest of compost supply companies to make sure that the sources of their materials aren't going to lead to problems. They don't want to damage their reputation, and they also are looking for your repeat business. So overall, they're paying attention to it, and it doesn't mean that sometimes things slip through. And then also just this fall, there was a bagged product that had herbicide contamination in it as well. So sadly, this is not an infrequent problem, and it's part of sourcing things on a regional level. And a compost maker only has control of what they're making, but they're buying feedstocks from lots of different sources. And absolutely, they're trying to pay attention to herbicide contamination, but it's not a foolproof system.
All right, thank you, Weston. I think that answers some of our questions for now. I don't know if you're ready to continue back, and we'll move to more questions towards the end.
Sure, absolutely. All right, thanks, folks. The next part of the presentation is on how to use compost in gardens and landscapes. As I mentioned last spring, when ODA was investigating the herbicide contamination in compost, they noticed that people were using compost incorrectly. So we made two publications that go hand in hand together. This one is on how to use compost in gardens and landscape. And we're going to return back to the original image that I showed you of what you really need to know. Add compost to the soil, spread it out, dig it in as deeply as possible. That's the very best way to improve soils, whether that's clay soil or whether that's sandy soil. Someone posted a question such as that in the Q&A before the presentation. How do you improve clay soil? The answer is by adding compost to it, and I'll go through the details of that through the second part of the presentation. All right, so purchased compost products vary widely, and it really depends on the source materials. Yard debris often is kind of poorer quality or sort of more coarse type compost. Forestry products, sawdust, ground bark, definitely crop residues and straw and hay could potentially have the herbicide contamination, but not necessarily. There's also mint, there's rice hulls, animal manures, chicken, cow, other livestock, food scraps. So if you're in the city of Portland and you have a green bin, all of that food scrap material goes to commercial industrial scale composting. It also is going to include material from wineries and breweries. Mushroom production as well, so mushroom compost, and then vermicompost. All of those materials are taken. Different vendors will combine things in different ways, and they'll create a balanced composting product. All of it's done on a commercial scale. I'm not going to be talking really about how to make compost. That's a whole nother topic. I do provide a good link for that later on. High quality compost should look and smell like topsoil. It should smell like you're in a forest. Don't want to get compost that has large chunks. If you're making compost yourself, you can definitely sift all this stuff out. I have bought piles of compost before, and it came in big solid chunks like this big, and that was really disappointing. You want to have a nice fine product that's passed through screens, and that way it's really easy to apply to your area. Use your nose. Have you ever smelled foul compost that might smell like ammonia or sulfur or abiotic? I have. I bought a pile that showed up. It's the same pile I just described. It had big chunks and it smelled like bacteria. It smelled abiotic. So I contacted the vendor and I asked for a refund, and fortunately we got it, but that compost was off. It had a bad smell. When you smell ammonia or sulfur, that's indicating that the composting process is incomplete. That's not a product that you want to buy. What you do want is if you buy a pile of compost from a vendor, or even if you are buying bags of material, you could look online and get details about that compost. And ideally, compost is going to have about 30% organic matter. The carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to be about 30:1, and this is for finished compost. All of the feedstocks will have varying degrees of that. At the end of a compost process, they're going to have about 0.5 to 3% nitrogen, less than 0.2% phosphorus. Ideally, high quality compost is going to be between 6 and 8 on the pH scale. And then each state has different standards for heavy metals, but you can check on that. And then also soluble salts. Some plants like blueberries and vegetables really don't like a lot of salt. If you get a compost that has a lot of salt, put it in your soil, it could damage your plants down the line. So ideally, I'd be wary of it with mushroom compost and some manures. Those sources of compost can have higher salts. One of the biggest mistakes that I see people making with compost is assuming that if you add compost to the soil, that's all you need in terms of fertility. As I mentioned just now, compost has low amounts of actual nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other minerals. And in general, what compost does is it improves the soil structure, the tilth, the suitability for planting in the long-term fertility, but it doesn't really help in the short term in terms of providing the nutrients that vegetables and whatnot really need to grow. What compost really does well is it feeds the soil microbes, and then the soil microbes break down the mineral component of the soil, and that's going to release nutrients like phosphorus, and that those will be available for your plants. Especially with vegetable gardening or rhododendrons or blueberries or roses or other relatively heavy feeders, you'll want to supply some source of nitrogen fertilizer as well. And in the example here, it's feather meal. Feather meal has a fertilizer ratio of 12:0:0. 12% nitrogen and no phosphorus, no potassium. That would be a really good source of nitrogen for vegetable gardening to complement your composting. How much compost do you need to cover an area to desired depth? Well, if you go to a store or a box store or nursery center, 1 cubic foot of compost would cover about 12 square feet, about 1 inch of compost. So 3 by 3 or 3.5 by 3.5, that square, if you spread out a bag, it'll be spread out really pretty thinly, about 1 inch. That would be totally appropriate for a lawn or for a vegetable garden. If you want to buy more compost, they typically come in units of 7.5 yards in a truckload. And a unit of compost would cover 800 square feet, so 20 by 40 to an area of about 3 inches deep. So if you're looking for an 800 square foot extension of your landscape where you're planting trees and shrubs and ground covers and whatnot, then about 3 inches of compost would be appropriate. So buying a truck would be a good call. Obviously, it gets cheaper as you buy more, and there's only so many bags that you can fit in the back of your car. If you are buying a bulk load of compost and there's access to your site, highly recommend that you look into a conveyor truck. So the picture here shows a man with a remote control. It's connected to a really large truck that has a conveyor belt sticking out the back, and it's basically shooting the soil onto my pre-prepared beds here in the photo. So I calculated the cost to like hire people and wheelbarrows to move the material, to rent a skid steer or something like that and dump it. And it turned out that the cost for the conveyor truck was very competitive and super convenient. All I had to do was prepare the soil, and they were able to put it exactly where I needed it. And then I just had to rake it smooth, and I was ready to go with my planting. Here's a common mistake with compost, and that is getting too much compost. Has anyone bought a huge pile of compost and not known what to do with it? Too much compost is a problem for a couple reasons. Basically, plants don't really like growing in straight up compost. They need the mineral components of soil as well. So one of the biggest mistakes that I see in vegetable gardening is people planting in straight compost. It really doesn't work out so well. What happens is that the compost will fuel the soil microbes, they'll break stuff down, and they'll release a lot of phosphorus. And then the plants will look stunted. They'll be a little bit purple. You'll have tiny little beets and tiny little carrots. They just won't be really healthy. So to avoid this problem, calculate your area, figure out the depth that you need, and then get the right amount of compost to cover that area. Don't just buy a pile of compost every year because that's what you think you should do. Compost is not the best of mulches. If you're looking for mulch between your plants, get wood chips or get bark mulch or something like that, because the weeds are less likely to grow. If you use if you use compost as mulch, you'll end up getting weeds growing in them pretty quickly. How to use compost for vegetable gardens. On your left-hand side, let's say you have a new vegetable garden area and you're ready to get going. I would probably, if you have like a lawn growing in that area, chip away the grass, expose the mineral soil, spread about 3 or 4 inches of compost out over that area. And then on the left-hand side, use a spading fork or a shovel to mix that material in as deeply as you can, up to a foot or so. That's going to be about the right amount of compost to use up front when you're doing an initial vegetable garden. For existing vegetable garden beds, see a lot of people add a couple inches a year or even more. It's really too much. You only really need about a 1/4 inch to 1 inch of compost per year. That's going to be enough to feed the microbes. Any more doesn't really do you any advantage, and it can cause harm in terms of too much phosphorus. So the take-home message is go easy with compost and vegetable gardening. Yes, it's a really good thing, but there very much is too much of a good thing. If you are getting, if you have raised beds that you're looking to fill, you'll want to excavate the area and first put the spoils of the excavation into the raised bed. And that's what's happening in the photo here, is that the material that was dug out is first placed in here. And then next, you'll want to fill it with a purchased 3-way mix or a 4-way mix. So when you go to a landscape supply company, these would be the mixes that are basically compost, soil, and sand is a 3-way mix, or a 4-way mix would also have pumice. Ask them specifically, I'm looking to fill raised beds. What kind of product do you recommend? And then what happens over time is that the volume is going to settle fairly significantly. So you'll want to either account for that by overfilling it a touch, or to get additional material down the line. It's going to be about 25 to 30% compaction. Another very common mistake is filling raised beds with straight up compost. These kids at a school garden are well-meaning. They're setting up raised beds, but if you look at the material closely, it looks like it's really black to me and it's just compost. Don't do this. It's going to end up not working out very well for growing the plants. And then also just add that these are fairly poorly constructed raised beds. If you're going to take the time to spend all the money to build raised beds, make sure that they're not going to fall apart really easily. How to use compost for landscape areas. And here's where if you have a light gap. So for me, I had a major tree damage this year. I have a new 20 by 20 area that I'm looking forward to taking over. The first step I'm going to do is to buy compost, spread it out about 3 or 4 inches deep, and then to dig it in as deep as I can with hand tools. And then we're going to, you're spreading it out and preparing the soil in aggregate, and then going and digging a planting hole in this amended soil. When the hole is backfilled, there's going to be the regular soil and a little bit of compost. You don't want to backfill a planting hole with just straight up compost. That won't work out very well. You do want to mix in compost in aggregate over the whole area, then dig your planting hole from there. What about compacted sites, you ask? Well, here's where, again, compost is your friend. This is looking like a really inhospitable place to grow plants. Sadly, what happens in new construction is the topsoil is totally scraped away. They expose the subsoil. They run over it with big machines, and then they add a little bit of compost on the surface and roll out some sod and plant a couple viburnums. That's not really going to set up a really healthy landscape. What I'd recommend in this situation is to dig deeply. So here's really compacted soil. And if you have a large machine and you hire it out, then you could add up to like 12 to 18 inches of compost, and then digging that in really, really deeply into the soil. Then all of a sudden you're going to have like 2.5 feet of well-prepared soil. And imagine buying a nice big, like a specimen tree and planting it in really well-prepared soil. It's going to take off very quickly and become established. Before you go digging with any heavy equipment, you need to call 811 utility locate to make sure you don't hit a gas line or electric line or cable or any other underground utilities. Here's an example of this process. This is a school in Polk County, And you can see that on the left-hand side, upper photo, compost is added. It's dug in with a tractor, dug in as deeply as possible here in the middle. Over to the right, it's looking pretty good. It's graded out. The plants are installed, and then mulch is installed afterward. And then if you do that process and prepare soil really well by adding compost and mixing it in very deeply, then the plants are going to become established relatively quickly. And these are drought tolerant plants chosen to do well without any supplemental irrigation. But because the soil was prepared well in advance, they are growing pretty well. And thanks to my colleague Neil Bell for all of these photos of the Parity School in Polk County. Here's another example of this magic of preparing soil well with compost. This is at the Oregon Garden, and you can see a raised area where the soil was well prepared. Plants are installed. A couple years later, they're filling in very nicely. And then a couple of years after that, the area is doing well. And then mind you, all of these drought tolerant plants are thriving in a situation without any supplemental irrigation. The only reason that's possible is because the soil is well prepared and appropriate plants that are drought tolerant are installed. Okay, next topic is how to use compost for new lawns. And if you are doing a new lawn, great. I would recommend the smallest area you want. It'll be less work in the long run. And the first step would be upon rototilling, you could definitely add compost and mix it in as best as you can. That will help to improve the soil conditions for seeding or for sod afterwards. The other situation in which you could use compost is to use it as a mulch to cover seed. After you install grass seed, so sprinkle it around, one of the very best things you can do to get the lawn established is to put mulch on the surface. It will help to retain water and make sure that the seeds get germinated. Really finely fine compost, just a very thin layer of about 1/4 inch or so would be appropriate. This device here is called a mulch roller. You can rent them. You fill it with the compost, you push it across the area, and it'll lay a very, very thin layer of mulch across, or compost in this case. How to use compost for existing lawns. The key would be top dressing. And the steps would be like this. So first of all, mow your lawn super short. Second, on the right-hand side is to use a dethatching machine, or excuse me, an aerator. The aerator is going to poke holes, and then compost can be spread on top of that. The compost would fall into those holes, help to improve the soil drainage. And then after that, seed would go on top. And then really on a regular basis, adding seed to your lawn is one of the very best ways to keep it looking good over the long term by continually refreshing the kinds of grasses that are growing in your lawn. So in this case, compost can be used to improve soil conditions, even on a lawn that's already established. And then if you add too much compost, you're going to see that the plants will be a little bit stunted. So purplish growth, it's going to be really similar to excess phosphorus growth. The other thing that can happen if you have a, big pile of compost is if water leaches through it, those nutrients, the phosphates, can leach into the groundwater table, or they could leach into surface water where they cause eutrophication. When a bunch of nutrients show up in water, algae is going to grow really readily, and then the algae will die, and as it breaks down, it'll rob the water body of oxygen. That process called eutrophication is definitely something to avoid, and one of the ways to do that is to go easy on the compost. Now I can answer questions on how to use compost in gardens and landscapes. If Heather, you want to chime in and ask some questions?
Sure, Weston, let me see here what we have. We have quite a few I have a question here. Let me see. There's a question from a Facebook visitor. Are compost
Sure.
standards different for fruit or fruit trees?
Composting for fruit and fruit trees, it would be very similar to landscape plants. So in advance, you'd want to prepare the soil by digging in compost. On an ongoing basis, I wouldn't really use compost as a mulch. I would use wood chips or something else to control weeds around the base of your fruit trees. But that soil preparation, just like at the school site that I showed, is going to be the same for fruit trees. The more time you spend up front digging compost into your soil, the easier it is to go dig a planting hole, and then the easier it is for the roots to penetrate into the soil and become established.
All right, great. We also had a question earlier about organic compost. Could you comment on that? Is it likely to cause any damage and have contaminants in it and that sort of thing?
Yeah, great question. A certified organic compost would mean that all of the materials are sourced according to the national organic law. And that would mean that everything is a plant, animal, or mineral source. The thing is that even organic compost, they're going to need to source materials from outside, even coming from an organic dairy. There's a possibility that those cows could have eaten contaminated hay. So I think it is safer, but it's not a sure bet. And that's where those preemptive practices that I talked about in terms of doing the bioassay test and doing some research on your product before you buy it would come into play.
Okay, great. Thanks, Weston. Do you want to comment about adding mycorrhizae to soil?
Sure. Mycorrhizal fungi are naturally occurring fungi. They have relationships with plants. They oftentimes facilitate nutrient exchange. My thought on them is that in most cases, they're already there in the soil, and you can feed them by adding compost to the soil or putting mulch on top of the surface. In some cases, like container growing, or if you have really super like nuked soil, for lack of a better word, you might consider using mycorrhizal fungi as an amendment. But overall, I don't think it's necessary. There's not a lot of research to suggest that it's effective. It probably is not going to hurt. If it makes you feel better adding it, it'll be relatively expensive, but harmless enough.
Okay, great. We have a couple questions on here about vermicompost.
Sure, go for it.
How do you add them? And another one is vermicompost more concentrated than regular compost? Use less or the same amount? Great
question. Vermicompost is going to have a little bit higher nutrient profile than regular compost. It's going to be more like 3-3-3 nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It's going to be more expensive. And I would use vermicompost for your seeding and things like that. I think it's not really practical in bulk because it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but it's going to be high quality, really like sweet spot in terms of compost in a lot of ways. What was the first one about vermicompost?
There was, the one about it being concentrated, and the one like how much do you add? I think that was.
How much do you add is, I suppose, as much as you can afford would be great, or using these same guidelines that I provided earlier would also be appropriate. And then incidentally, here's another publication for you, How to Use Compost in Gardens and Landscapes, extension publication EM 9307. So all those details that I just described, the amounts of compost, et cetera, are well detailed here.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here about, from Barbara, we have lots of roots in our garden flower bed, so it's hard to mix in the compost. How do I avoid damage to the roots and still get the compost into the soil?
I'm assuming you're talking about roots of trees or established shrubs. You're not going to be able to dig that in very well. You could lay a little bit of compost on the surface and it's going to slowly work its way through the soil. I guess what if there are pockets where you can put a plant in, that's great, but adding compost and digging it in deeply is not going to be a possibility if you have the roots of woody plants in your bed.
Okay. I have a question here about biochar. And I know you discussed it a little bit, but is there some recommendations about applying biochar when you're planting or to your soils?
Biochar is similar to mycorrhizal fungi, and there's not a ton of research about it. What it does do is it's a carbon source that would feed the soil microbes. It also is going to kind of lock up that carbon for longer periods of time. Biochar is really expensive. Compost is much cheaper. I think my recommendation would be to pass on the biochar and go straight to compost, follow the recommendations that I talked about, and you can grow very, very healthy plants.
Okay, great. I have a question about lasagna gardening. Let me see. Unfortunately, the questions just moved because somebody added a new question,
So,
or maybe it was answered. It was something about where in the layers do you apply? Oh, here it is. I'm creating a new planting area with lasagna layer techniques. Would the compost be best placed thickly at the bottom or thinly as a top layer?
I would put the compost in contact with the soil because the compost is going to help to break down the mineral component of the soil. If it were me, compost, dig it into the mineral component and then layer on top of that.
Okay, thank you very much. Here's a question. It's kind of related more to the pesticide contamination from earlier.
Sure.
So are there risks of
Go for it.
pesticide contamination with other landscape products such as bark mulch, wood chips, etc.?
The risk of herbicide contaminated compost is going to be less from bark mulch because there's no hay or manure involved in that feedstock. It's just straight up wood product. And similarly with wood chips as well. I haven't heard of any issues with herbicide contamination in straight up mulch products. It's more in compost and soil mixes where there's a variety of feedstocks that include animal manures and bedding, hay, and potentially like grass clippings from lawns and whatnot.
Great. I have a question here. It says, I have always thought of compost as an eco-friendly, slow-released fertilizer. So would you mind, I guess, commenting on if the nutrient value of compost? And it says, I do use a fish fertilizer for fast-acting nutrition, but would you recommend adding a slow-release fertilizer as well?
Great question. Compost does foster long-term fertility. The longer it's there, the compost works its way into the mineral component of the soil. Once soil temperatures warm up in the spring, it's going to release nutrients. So that's why if you've improved your soil over a period of a couple years, like come year 3 to 5 of running the same plot, things get better because the soil just kind of comes into its own. A lot of that is from the addition of organic matter, both improving the soil structure and also the release of nutrients. Using soluble fertilizer like you described is a great idea to help get things going early in the season, especially before the soil microbes really kick into gear. So keep doing that. If you are not noticing any problems, I don't think you need to add any fertilizer if you've been adding compost to your soil for a long period of time. If you see that things are a little bit on the yellowy side, your plants are looking yellowish, i.e. chlorotic, then you might consider adding a slow release fertilizer. That feather meal that I showed earlier would be one good example. Osmocoated synthetic fertilizers would be good, but I do like your idea about a slow release fertilizer rather than a fast acting fertilizer.
All right, Weston. So we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to ask one more question here, I guess, and then I'm going to have a few closing statements. So the last question, we've had a lot of questions about using bags compost instead of, like a source that you buy in bulk. Is that more likely to be safe. And, I think there's a question as well about organic, which you had already addressed.
Yeah. I have heard of fewer incidents from herbicide contamination with bagged products. The exception is I think it was in November, December of this year, there was an instance of that. You can always do the bioassay test on bagged product as well. Go to a store, see if they have a mountain of compost bags. Know that if you take one home and you do the bioassay test and you come back a month later and they have the same stock of material, you would be safe. Certainly can't hurt to do that. Also, just being aware of the symptoms of herbicide damage and knowing, if you start to see the damage, what you can do about it from there. But overall, like I said, do your research up front. So for example, if you're going to buy a bagged compost, look at that brand, go to their website, start poking around, see what you can find, call them. If you really want to know, the more research you do up front, the better off you'll be.
All right, thank you very much, Weston. I very much appreciate all your time here today. I have put
Sure,
in
it's my pleasure.
Yep, I have put in the Qualtrics survey or evaluation for Weston in the chat box. So if you wouldn't mind going and filling that out. And then I have put as well some of these links to the extension publications that Weston has mentioned. And again, we can provide those links if you can't find them, but they are in the chat box. So again, I do want to thank you very much, Weston, for coming today. If you did not get your question answered today, there's lots of questions left in the chat box. Unfortunately, we only have a limited amount of time, but feel free to contact your local extension office for further assistance with your questions. We will also, as I mentioned, we have the links to the publications in the chat box, and many of the questions you're asking are also in there. If you are a Master Gardener volunteer, you can receive continuing education credits for today's session. Track and submit your time through the guidance in your county coordinator. We also have approval for 1 Oregon Landscape Contractors Board credit hour for watching this webinar. So please contact me, Heather Stoven, if you are licensed with the Oregon Landscape Contractors Board and would like to receive a credit. Our next webinar in this series will be Dazzling Dahlias on April 13th. The whole schedule for Growing Oregon Gardeners Level Up series is on our website. We hope to see you at a future session. In the meantime, happy gardening.
Take care. Thanks for joining us, folks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to stay on here for a couple more minutes just to leave you all the ability to see the survey and also the publication.